Okay, guys, if you want to master the art of bluffing, here's what I teach you depending on how much time you've got and how much you're willing to digest. Here's some tips for 10 seconds of your time, 10 minutes of your time, or 10 days of your time. All right, guys, I'm going to tell you how to do this in 10 seconds. For 10 seconds, the two concepts that you need are simplicity of your bluff and also having the advantage in the hand, specifically or often the initiative as the aggressor. So simplicity is just checks the river, you bet, you just take a stab at it, you bet at some point in the hand and just take a stab at it and you just try to win the pot with nothing. A piece of shit hand and something that this guy has no shot on value. Pretty simple. And then the idea of taking it when you have the advantage is largely if you're the preflop aggressor in the first place. The short version of this is usually you have the stronger range, you've got the stronger hand, so you can bet, and the other guy is a little bit powerless, or at least his power is reduced and he can't do a whole lot about it. It's pretty much that simple. If you had raised preflop from before, if you're the last preflop raiser in the action and he calls you, you can bet at some point in the hand and probably win it. All right, guys, now for 10 minutes, I have 4 different concepts for you to teach you in 10 minutes about bluffing. So one of them is going to be to bluff people who have the tendency of overfolding or have weak ranges overall or weak hands overall. The second one is bluffing people with when the board is dry, where it's very hard to have anything. If they're not going to make the right calls, they're going to get bluffed too much. The third one is semi-bluffing. If you have a flush draw, big draw, open-ended with a couple overcards, these are examples of this. And the fourth one is bluffing when you have the range advantage, meaning that you just have stronger hands than they've got and they're likely to fold. Here's an example of how you might bluff a weak player, even though you don't have too much depth yet into what you can do poker-wise. You just see somebody calling and folding a lot, and you can take that and say, okay, they're bluffable within reason to a certain extent and just try some simple bluffs against them, raising pre-flop, c-betting the flop, that kind of thing, or checking the river and betting the river, or just trying even a little bit of creativity and betting flop and then checking turn, betting river, in position, out of position, as a pre-flop raiser. That is just worth trying in the beginning, even if you're not that great at it, even if you mess it up by betting too big at some point, it's worth it to just get in there and give it a shot. A more specific example for you guys is you raise on the button and the big blind calls. The flop is 2-3-4. It goes check, check. There's a very high chance the person in position is a high card and the person out of position has whatever. The turn's a 7. There's no flush draw. It goes check, check again. The river's a 9. And both players have crap a lot of the time. In fact, the in position players' range is stronger than the out of position players' range in general, and it's hard to have anything. But both players could bluff if either player just does not call enough in the situation. And if either player doesn't call enough, then the other player wins money. The next situation is a semi-bluff. Pretty simple. We've got a big draw, and we're not particularly worried if they call or not. If you have a flush draw, it's great. If you have a flush draw with 2 overs, it's even better, and almost always semi-bluffed at some point. Check raised all in, even. So if you have like queen jack with 2 hearts, and the flop is 10-9-4 with 2 hearts, it almost doesn't matter what the action is. Pre-flop, you can check raise or bet and bluff and do all kinds of things with this sort of hand. Very, very great spot. And matter of fact, if you have a big semi-bluff like this, it's like basically like having a really strong hand. It's almost the same thing. This is a rare combination, and you want to be picking some kind of line that's unique with it because of its uniqueness and power. The last kind of bluff is the bluff where you have the range advantage. The theme of it's pretty simple. The way it shows up and turns up later on into the hand can be variegated, to say the least, and there's all kinds of different permutations. But basically, whatever the previous action in the hand was dictates who has what kinds of hands or what kind of frequencies of different versions of hands, what the distribution of the hands is later on in the hand, and what the form of the betting looks like. Simple example being, okay, you raise pre-flop, you get called in the big blind from under the gun, and the flop is ace high. Well, guess what? Under the gun has loads of aces in its range, and the big blind doesn't. The big blind has 9-8 offsuit, maybe a lot of suited hands that just whiff the board and have no chance to win, essentially, and don't make any sense to check raise. So the action's going to go check to the button, and the button's going to bet a lot of the time, and the big blind can't do a damn thing about it. So that's the fourth bluff for you, or an example of it anyway. And if you master these kinds of bluffs, and practice them to the point where they make sense to you, you're doing them reasonably well, you'll do well. That's for sure. Now that we've got the 10-second and the 10-minute bluff plan, it's time for the 10-day bluff plan to apply these concepts of the 4 different kinds of bluffs that I just mentioned. The first one being bluffing weak players. Second one being bluffing people when they have not so great hands. The third one being semi-bluffing, and the fourth one being bluffing where you've got the range advantage. These bluffs that I just mentioned don't cover all bluffs, but they're good starting ground for ones that are going to be effective. Absolutely need to know for your game because they cover the majority. The rest of them are going to be in the category of GTO, meaning that they're part of the game, but they're going to be harder to pull off. And this is where this 10-day period is also where we start doing some of those as well. And this is where we get more into the pro level sorts of things. So a big part of the 10-day period is going to be the application of actually doing this stuff. And so a big theme of this is going to be playing low stakes so that you can try to get used to running these bluffs and figuring out where the best times are to actually do them. You want to play stakes where you're not really going to lose a lot, and you want to get over the fear of taking the risk to do it in the first place. You want to get over a bit of anxiety and giving off live tells and things like that on stakes that don't matter, because if you play higher stakes, there's a much higher chance you give off live tells, much higher chance you don't pull the trigger in the right spots, and a much higher chance you lose your money. And that's no good. We don't need that. Another big thing that we need to do is start studying the game. We need to be introduced, ideally, if we're taking this really seriously, we need to be introduced to solvers and to look at the various situations and see how they play out. And in game theory, ideally even running drills. You can run drills on GTO Wizard, and it's a very, very effective way to learn many of the poker spots. If you do this and you get used to them, you're going to figure out how a lot of the spots work in no time and learn where you've got the range advantage and where you don't. And even learn some GTO bluffs that you have to run too when you don't have the range advantage that are neutrally V and the part of the game as well. All right, another thing, guys, that we're going to be doing is we're going to be reviewing our sessions and figuring out what we could have been doing better and where we could have pulled the trigger, and ideally even getting someone else to look at it, such as myself or another coach, so that they can identify what your leaks are. If you do something like this, for sure, you're going to improve quite fast. And check out some spots in the solvers, such as GTO Wizard, one of my affiliates. You're going to get a very good feeling for what you could do at GTO and what you couldn't. And if you toy around with the idea of exploiting your opponents more, you're going to find more spots where you can exploit opponents and really be able to get a better intuition for where you can bluff people and where you can't. This is going to be one of the things we're 100% doing if we're thinking about getting better at poker seriously within 10 days of learning how to bluff. If you're doing the drills at GTO Wizard and you're playing with the solvers, we're going to get more of an idea of how to mix our hands with our value hands. We're going to get more of an intuition of how to pair our value hands with our bluffs and create more of an overall strategy of our game. This is the period or amount of time frame where we have roughly this kind of idea and a more of an overall concept of poker coming together. It doesn't need to formulate super efficiently straight away in this 10-day period, but we want to be introduced to this kind of idea somewhat fast once we've got a bit of a clue of how things are supposed to happen. This is also where we start building this conditioning and this idea of being a bit more zen while we're playing and not really caring. Maybe even have this idea of starting to meditate while we're playing if we're taking things seriously again. But over time, for the most part, we will be getting slowly more adapted to playing poker on the whole and bluffing on the whole. We'll definitely get more used to losing, that is bluffing getting caught, and you need a bit of that mental conditioning to get better at bluffing anyway. And within 10 days, I think you can get some of it anyway, because you'll get caught and fucked up a little bit, which is okay. Also in this period, this is where we should be learning a bit about the meta game of what's going on, such as your image and how that affects things, how people perceive you, and how you can use that to either bluff or not bluff at all. Of course, you won't be able to know like perfectly all of this, but you'll be able to know if someone thinks you're crazy, or if you've just been caught bluffing a bunch of times that maybe you shouldn't bluff again, or you've just been tight the entire time and people think that you're tight, so that means you can bluff. Another thing that you'll be learning during this time is to better identify the weak players that you can bluff and start to be able to read people properly and start to be able to see more clearly and think to yourself, okay, I've saw that they've given off this information to bluff. I know I gave an example earlier in the 10-minute example of like, someone folds like top pair, top kicker, but this is also where you won't be able to know that in 10 minutes really, but you'll be able to better identify now in this 10-day period that people are too tight and therefore likely bluffable. You'll better now in this 10-day period be able to identify if someone's tight and more bluffable and see a bit more nuance in their game and see, okay, like there's something there that people are making some tight folds. So now we can bluff them. Now that we've got a bit more depth to our game, we can identify the weaknesses in people's games a bit more clearly and start to see, okay, that maybe we can bluff people off top pair, or maybe we can 3-bet them too much because that they're opening too much or they're check folding the flop a lot and just not playing back very much at all. This is an example for the 10 days. The first example is of if the player's weak and they just overfold. Just suppose that you know a guy is going to fold a lot of top pairs a lot of the time. On an ace-x board, he's going to fold ace-queen if you triple barrel and you're under the gun, he's on the button and he's in the big blind, and suppose you raise and the flop is, and he calls, he's on the button or big blind, and the flop is ace 9-4. You bet, he calls, the turns is 5. You bet, he calls, the rivers is 7. You bet, he calls, there's no flush draw, there is a flush draw, and you know for whatever reason he just folds ace queen, he's scared money. That would be the example of bluff number 1. If you just know that the guy is not going to call with hands that he just should call with, and these players are especially good to bluff with if they're really, really tight and make crazy folds like that, like near top pair, top kicker. Or 2, they're really loose and passive. They're really loose in general, I would say, in fact, but loose and passive would be the best case scenario, meaning they just have lots of random hands that they're not supposed to have that they're going to give up because they don't have any idea of what to do with, and they just have problems with their overall range. Triple barrel with many random hands on an ace-high board. If you believe that, if you see or have this suspicion that somebody's folding top pair a really large amount of the time, you can with quite some liberty take a lot of hands and bluff them off top pair, especially when your range is strong. So if you raise an early position, they call in the button or in the big blind and the flop is ace high, it's ace 9-4, something like that. They check, you bet, they check if they're out of position, or you just checks to you, you bet, they call, the turn's a 7. Again, you're the one to bet, you bet, they call, there's a 5, there's no flush. If there's a flush, it changes things. You bet again and they fold like ace jack. Then this is where you can try these kinds of bluffs and learn and see if it works or not, and try these kinds of exploits against different people. In summary, guys, bluffing has a lot of layers to it. It's quite a bit of an art, and there's a lot of science to it, matter of fact, and a lot of it's trial and error, but if you practice, you'll get there, and the more effort you put in, the more you'll be able to apply different layers of subtlety to it to learn more and more and add more finesse to what you're doing. The first 10 seconds of learning how to bluff is just getting in there, trying a couple, and simplicity. The first 10 minutes about learning how to bluff is introduction to the concepts, the different kinds of spots to bluff. The first 10 days of how to bluff is really the introduction to the true depth of what you'd find if you're looking at poker, if we're talking seriously anyway, and towards what execution looks like, and getting used to doing this, and getting used to bluffing and failing, but bluffing and succeeding as well, and also to just getting your feet wet and trying some stuff. And if you want to learn more and you found this useful and you're thinking to yourself, well, what can I do in 10 months? Then I suggest that you get help from outside, and this will greatly expedite your process in learning. Speaking of which, the Jungleverse. Click below. There's a community of players, including myself, that are out there to help you and collaborate with you. We've got tons of resources that will help you to succeed in poker and also in your life. The whole goal of the Jungleverse is so that you can make enough money through poker or with its tools to become financially free. Join us and let's all succeed together.